Johnson steps in, checks the signs, makes a few adjustments. This is a classic confrontation.
From the beginning of our time on this planet, we have had one major conflict that has shown its head throughout history. A conflict that stems from our evolutionary need to belong.
How ready you are to move this country forward? That is the question which separates Mr. Nixon and myself.
A human trait that has divided us for centuries and will continue until we change our ways. A conflict between us and them.
Have you ever thought about why dog people and cat people can't find commonality in the fact that they both love animals? And this stems from a human trait that has followed us since the beginning. A need to categorize ourselves in groups. And this is a story that started at the beginning of human history. And a story I'm sure we're all familiar with. The story of Cain and Abel. The biblical story that is shared across multiple religions, including Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. But what many people don't know is that there's an ancient Sumerian story that shares a very similar theme. A story of nomadic shepherds and settled farmers. And a conflict that comes about when these two different groups meet for the first time. It speaks to the development of human society and our evolving lifestyles. There are many scholars who believe the Cain and Abel story speaks to the same human development, from when our ancestors moved away from nomadic shepherds to settled farmers. And this is represented in the Cain and Abel story in the lifestyles that they live. And it ends in Cain killing Abel, the farmers killing the nomadic shepherds. Like I said, there's a lot of people that believe that these two stories share a commonality in their themes. And the theme of this is a conflict between us and them. And what these two stories highlight is a human trait that we've seen throughout history when two different groups come together, when groups with different beliefs and lifestyles meet each other, and more often than not, it ends in conflict. As humans, we have this need to break things into groups. These groups help us better understand the world that we're living in, where we feel safe and where we don't, where we can share our beliefs and ideologies and where we can't. And no matter how much we've evolved since these stories were written, our habits haven't actually changed that much. And there's a biological reason for this. It's known as oxytocin.
Oxytocin. It's dubbed the love hormone.
But oxytocin is responsible for a lot more than just love. New science has shown this amazing molecule also influences how sociable each of us is. Kind of allows us to tune in to the social information around us, allowing us to perceive it in much higher resolution.
What oxytocin does is phenomenal. It promotes pro-social behavior, it increases trust, empathy, understanding, and collaboration. This single chemical has played a massive role in our evolution and is partly responsible for where we are as a species today. It's responsible for all of the development that has come from collaboration, but it's also responsible for most wars and conflict between groups throughout history. When we're exposed to groups with different ideologies and beliefs, we feel threatened. And there's an immediate identification of us and them. And generally, conflict between these ideas, or the merging of these ideas, is met with war and destruction. The destruction of the opposing beliefs and ideas. And this has actually been seen in the development of ideas and beliefs. where a society will kick out those holding older traditions and beliefs, while new traditions and beliefs are celebrated within the group. And then during the 16th to the 18th century, we had a massive evolution to this conflict. And it was the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment put forward the idea of individualism, where every child is born with a clean slate. And the child learns and builds their identity around their own experiences of the world. And this is different to before, where communities and groups would share experiences and learnings from stories, from history, and then we get postmodernism. And postmodernism went a few steps further than the Enlightenment and turned everything on its head. Now, individuals don't have a clear sense of self, but rather find their identity within multiple ideas that are often contradictory. The Sumerian story speaks to a conflict between groups, different lifestyles and different ideas. The Cain and Abel story speaks to a conflict within a group, between two brothers who, yes, have different lifestyles, but are part of the same collective us. The next evolution of this conflict seems to be a conflict within the self. Cain in conflict with himself, but the previous conflicts don't go away. So we actually live in a much more conflictual world with a conflict we don't really understand. And I think this has left us in a very weird space, where previously we had a group identity that could ground us while we explored other ideas outside of that group identity. Now, we need to build an identity based on our own experiences. And if we don't have a group of people that can share similar experiences, we're left feeling quite lonely. And we can see this with Gen Z, who is statistically the loneliest generation with the most anxiety and the most depression. And for me, this is a consequence of this postmodern individualistic idea of the world.
We've realized that loneliness is more than just a bad feeling. It has real consequences for our mental and physical health. It increases our risk of depression, anxiety, and suicide. But COVID has poured fuel on a fire that was already burning. It's exacerbated loneliness and isolation, but this has been building now for decades. We've in fact seen a decrease in participation in community organizations and faith organizations and recreational leagues over several decades. We've seen that technology has fundamentally changed how we interact with one another and how we communicate with one another, and unfortunately has often replaced what used to be rich in-person connections with online connections, which often are of lower quality. But what we have to do now in modern life is intentionally build in the infrastructure we need for connection in our individual lives as well as in our communities.
And this idea, I believe, has left Gen Z vulnerable, and vulnerable to something that's been around a really long time: politics. And more specifically in today's culture, identity politics. For the longest time, politics has made use of an us versus them system, where those with similar ideas would vote for similar ideas. Conservative thinking people would vote for a conservative leaning party, and vice versa for liberalism and whatever other parties you want to throw in there. However, identity politics is playing on the idea of morality. If you're with us, you're good. If you're against us, you're bad. And if you're not with us, you're against us. And we've seen this conflict with the war between Russia and Ukraine, and more recently between Israel and Palestine. And no matter which way you look at it, human beings are being killed. And the morality side of it is being used for political leverage.
The conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians is at its core about identity.
Supporters of Israelis and Palestinians rallying in cities across the country, even as confrontations ratchet up while the unrest rages on.
Members of Congress are cashing in on war, both the war in Ukraine and now the conflict in Israel-Palestine.
From both sides of the aisle are tailoring their investment portfolios based on these defense contractors and energy companies, all of which lobby Capitol Hill heavily.
One of the interpretations of the Cain and Abel story is a cautionary tale about unresolved conflict and the need for effective communication and resolution. Now more than ever, I think we need to learn from this. Our world is changing really fast, and we are interacting with so many different groups on a daily basis. Conflict between us and them is not going to go away. This mentality is ingrained in who we are. But I think it's time that we start looking at opening up discussions between us and them so we can find commonality. And in this world where we want to focus on individualism and our own unique experience of the world, I think it's important to remember that people who have gone through tremendously difficult experiences have written about it so that future generations can learn. And if we're only focusing on our own individual experience, we're not opening ourselves up to the teachings from people from the past. We as individuals need to start understanding how we can best bring our individual experience of the world to the group so that next generations and future generations don't have to go through the same suffering that we might be. I think it's important that we become aware of the conflict that's being sown through identity politics and the conflict that is being based on our own morality. I think we need to be able to step back and say what is good and what is bad in every situation and open that up to a discussion. Let's look at what the actual impact is on society and what the people who are pushing this message want from us. Do they want us distracted while something else is happening on the side? Or do they generally want the best outcome for all parties involved? And when it comes to politics, I'm highly skeptical of the latter. Now more than ever, we need to start having conversations. Tough conversations about our values, ideas, beliefs, and lifestyles. Conversations that might be a bit confronting, but rather confronting conversations than a conflict that leaves us in a world of pain. Literally.